Hello everyone, this is Rick and today we are going to discuss about position of women in Buddhism. Now this is going to be a very short documentary regarding the topic of how were the lives of nuns in the religion of Buddhism. We are going to go through an entire timeline projecting the early views of nuns in Buddhism and how that view with the passage of time changed into a more modern approach. So without doing any delay, let's get into details. Early perceptions and resistance. So in the early phase of Buddhism, there was not any good perception regarding the advocation of nuns into the Sangha. Therefore, we will have to visit the early instances and the stories of resistance related to establishment of nunneries or bhikkhuni sanghas in Buddhism. Buddha's reluctance to admit women to the Sangha is noted, predicting a decline from 1000 to 500 years for the Dharma's longevity if women were admitted. So initially, Lord Buddha was of the view that if women are to be admitted to the Sangha, then the Dharma of Buddhism will decline in about 1000 to 500 years. Now this was the early perception of Buddha regarding the admission of women into the Sangha. Mahapajapati Gautami, who was Buddha's foster mother, was very much persistent, ultimately leading to the establishment of Bhikkhuni Sangha. So, Mahapajapati Gautami was the foster mother of Lord Buddha, and Buddha couldn't deny her when she was very persistent regarding the establishment of Bhikkhuni Sangha. Text portray women as potential hindrances, using metaphors like snakes and fire to suggest threats to monastic purity. So according to the early Buddhist text, the women were considered to hinder the monastic purity, the monastic discipline, and metaphors like snakes and fires were used to project the fact that if women are to be admitted to the Sangha, then there will be impurity in the monastic order. Vinaya Pitaka explicitly outlines Buddha's prediction about Sangha's decline due to women's admission. So, Lord Buddha predicted that since women are being admitted to the Sangha, there will be huge decline in Buddhism and it will survive for only about 1000 to 500 years, and that has been told in Vinaya Pitaka. I am not saying this, but in the sources of Buddhist text, typically the Vinaya Pitaka, there it has been told that Buddha's prediction regarding women's admission in the Sangha was very much negative. The Sangha imposed strict rules for women, requiring permissions from male relatives to join, indicating a gendered hierarchy. So in order for a woman to join the Sangha, she needed to have permission of her husband, brother or father. So a male relative's consent was very much necessary in order to join the Sangha for a woman, indicating that there was a gendered hierarchy in the society at that period of time. Spiritual narratives and nuns' accomplishments. Now there were many spiritual narratives regarding the admission of nuns to the monastic order. The Samyutta Nikaya and Anguttara Nikaya mention learned nuns such as Khema, who impressed the Buddha with her wisdom. So there has been evidences of mention of learned nuns such as Khema, who was supposed to impress Buddha with her wisdom. The text includes poems from nuns like Dhamma, revealing the spiritual achievements of women in the early Sangha. So in the early Sangha, there were many great nuns who is said to have attained so much of spiritual wisdom that Lord Buddha was impressed. And two such nuns mentioned are Khema and Dhamma. Anguttara Nikaya records conversation between the Buddha and the laywoman Vishakha, showing the deep theological engagements of women. So Vishakha was a laywoman, means she was not from the monastic order, neither did she know much about Buddhism. So she was a normal follower of Lord Buddha, and Buddha interacted with Vishakha, showing that there was deep theological engagement between woman and Lord Buddha. The Therigatha comprises 73 poems by elder nuns who are called as bhikkhunis, who attain significant spiritual attainment, suggesting a respected status for some women. So there are 73 poems composed by the elder nuns in the book called Therigatha, and thus we come to know that there were respected women who attained spiritual status. The rules in Vinaya Pitaka for nuns were as rigorous as for the monks, emphasizing a parallel path for spiritual practice with additional constraints. So there were the rules for women in the monastic order were as much as the rules for the monks, but there were some extra constraints on the mannerisms and discipline of women. Monastic regulations and women's life. What were the monastic laws specifically mentioned for women, and how were the lives of women in the monastic order? Women in the Sangh faced 8 special rules subordinating them to monks, highlighting a gendered structure. So it was very clear that monks were in the highest position, and under them came the nuns. And there was a set of rules where 8 special rules were there reserved only for the nuns, thus they were subordinate to the monks. Vinaya Pitaka describes the complex procedure for a woman to become a bhikkhuni, including ordination by both monks and nuns. So for a woman to become bhikkhuni, it was a very much complex procedure as stated in the Vinaya Pitaka, and for her to attain the monastic principles or to get admitted into the monastic order, ordination was required by both monks and nuns. Accounts like that of Patachara in Vinaya Pitaka detail the challenges and triumphs of the nuns. So there are stories like that of Patachara in Vinaya Pitaka where details about the challenges faced by a nun in order to get admitted into the Buddhist monastic order has been described. Rules required careful regulation of interaction between monks and nuns, indicating societal concerns about gender relations. So there were certain protocols to be followed when there was interaction between a monk and a nun. Thus there is an indication regarding the societal concerns about different kind of gender relations that existed at that point in the society. The expectation of women to seek permission from male relatives to join the Sangh reflects the social norms about women's autonomy. So women were not completely autonomous, because for them to join the Sangh, they were required to have some kind of permission from the male relatives of their family. Thus, we come to know a great deal about women's autonomy in the Buddhist society. Rituals, roles and gender. What kind of role was there for the nuns in the rituals, and what was the reserved role for their gender? Buddhism retained certain Brahmanical rights, such as suggesting an adaptation to existing social norms. So Brahmanical principles and Brahmanical order was very much prevalent at the time when Buddhism came into existence. Therefore, Buddhism retained certain Brahmanical rights, suggesting that there was an adaptation towards the existing social norms at that period. The continuation of these rites within Buddhism illustrates the religion's strategic positioning within societal fabric. So it was a strategy for Buddhism to flourish without any kind of disturbance from the Brahmanical order. Therefore, for their own survival, they had to position themselves strategically as a new philosophy with elements of adaptation from the Brahmanical rites which already existed prominently at that point of time. While the texts do not detail women's specific roles in these rituals, the overarching context suggests a secondary position. So, in Brahmanical order of the later Vedic period, women had a secondary position in the ritual. Therefore, even though there is no detailed information regarding the role of women in the rituals, we can understand that women had a very secondary position in all kinds of rituals in those periods. The cultural landscape influenced how women's participation in religious life was structured within Buddhism. So, women's participation in religious life was a result of the cultural aspects which were there at the period of 4th or 5th century BC. The adherence to certain Brahmanical practices by Buddhism can be seen as a reflection of the greater dynamics of the time. So, it was the adherence of certain Brahmanical practices by Buddhism was a reflection of the cultural norms which existed at that period of time. Now, changing attitudes over time. Whatever we have discussed, the negative aspects of the nuns in the monastic order, the negative view towards the nuns in the monastic order is of the phase of early Buddhism. However, over time, the Buddhist doctrine accepted nuns and there was a change in attitude. Initial textual references highlight a rigid stance towards women's monastic lives with many restrictions. So, all the text of early Buddhism suggests that there was very much rigidity towards the life of nuns in the Buddhist monastic order. Comparative analysis of early and later texts reveal a gradual shift towards a more inclusive attitude. So, as time went on, the attitude towards the acceptance of nuns into the monastic order became more and more inclusive. Despite restrictions, women's monastic communities were visible and active, contributing to the spread of Buddhism. So, even though there were many restrictions towards the discipline order of the nuns, there were many monastic communities which were very much prevalent throughout history and they contributed a lot to the spread of Buddhism throughout the world. The Therigatha and later texts portray women with spiritual agency counterbalancing earlier negative stereotypes. So the later texts like the Therigatha suggest that women had a respectable amount of spiritual power or spiritual agency. Thus, we see a change of attitude from the earlier negative stereotype to the modern progressive and inclusive attitude towards the nuns. The changing attitudes within the Buddhist text likely mirror broader societal changes regarding women's role. So the changing attitude is also another reflection of the change in society at that point of time. Gender norms in early Buddhism. What were the gender norms that were followed in the early phase of Buddhism? The establishment of bhikkhuni sangha and their accompanying rules reflect the patriarchal norms of the time. So in the beginning it was very much of a patriarchal norm within the monastic order and thus the establishment of bhikkhuni sangha reflect the patriarchal norms. Certain groups of women, such as those who were pregnant or menstruating, were initially prohibited from joining the Sangha. So the pregnant women and women who had the capability of producing babies were exempted from joining the Sangha. They were not allowed to join the monastic order. The text suggests an expected subservience of women to men, with rules emphasizing their subordinate position. So initially the nuns lived under the monks, and thus there are specific rules which emphasize that their position was subordinate to the monks in the monastic order. Despite constraints, nuns like Dhamma and Khema were recognized for their wisdom and teachings. So even though we find that there were several restraints towards the life of nuns, we get examples of nuns like Dhamma and Khema who were very much prominent for their spiritual wisdom. Ananda, the disciple of Buddha, is often credited for advocating the case for women's ordination, indicating internal support within the Sangha. So Ananda was a very much prominent and influential Buddhist monk who was a direct disciple of Buddha, and he seems to have been played a very much important role for advocating the case or right of women to join the Buddhist monastic order. Thus we come to know that the nuns had support from internal administration within the Sangha. Now in conclusion, we will go through an overview of the entire discussion. Complex history. The history of women in Buddhism is marked by a complex interplay between cultural norms and the religion's evolving teachings. So there was a complex interplay between the cultural norms at the time and the evolutionary concept of the religion. Women's position within Buddhism transformed from being significantly restricted to one where their contributions are acknowledged and celebrated. The accounts of learned nuns and their teachings continue to influence Buddhist practices and the understanding of women's roles. Buddhist scriptures serve as a testament to changing perceptions and roles of women within the religious context. Today's discussions on gender in Buddhism often reflect on these historical contexts to inform contemporary practices and egalitarian developments. So that was all about the position of women in Buddhism. We have seen the rise of the evolutionary process in Buddhism from a very conservative attitude towards women to a very progressive modern attitude. That was all for today. Hope you liked it, and please support me so that I can bring brighter contents in future. Thank you so much.